are going to be an affirmative for Edward de Vere, and our argument for Edward de Vere is: we formally believe that the poser Edward de Vere is the real face behind the works of William Shakespeare. I introduce this argumentative claim with some facts that lead up to why we infer this mind-boggling evidence. The case for Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. Many Oxfordians believe that the true author of Shakespeare's plays was an aristocrat named Edward de Vere. This evidence for this comprehensive ranging from Edward de Vere's knowledge of the upper classes through to his education and the structural similarities between his poetry and Shakespeare's. As regards authorship of Shakespeare's plays and sonnets, it has been suggested that Edward wrote these under the works of Shakespeare, both to avoid breaking a voluntary convention against aristocrats, publishing poetry and plays, and to escape the consequences of the subject matter he was writing about. George Putnam, 1589, book, The Art of English Poesies, explains this further. Below are the major reasons Oxfordians claim Edward de Vere was well qualified to write 37 plays and 154 sonnets. Therefore, my partner and I say no, we do not believe that this William Shakespeare is the author of some of the greatest works of literature. Edward de Vere and Elizabeth Theatre. Edward de Vere, Earl...
No. Keep going.
Is known to compose, directed, and acted in plays around the same time as Shakespeare. Like Shakespeare, he was one of an acting troupe, but unlike Shakespeare, Edward managed his acting troupe called Oxford Boys. Furthermore, Edward de Vere was a leaseholder of the Blackfriars Theatre, a rival to the Globe. Edward's poetry and its similarities between Shakespeare. While most academics agree that Edward de Vere poetry was better than the Sir Francis Bacon's, the other contender for replacing Shakespeare, few believe it is of standard necessary to prove de Vere wrote the 154 sonnets claimed to have been authored by Shakespeare. Similarities in Edward de Vere's verse to Shakespeare suggest how that such an elite poetry composing was possible. Specifically, 6-line pentameter stanzas in Venus and Adonis occur only in Edward de Vere's early poems and are yet not repeated by other poets. Of similarities in form between Edward claimed to be Shakespeare's. Edward de Vere's knowledge of Elizabethan courts and his superior education. It is recognized by Oxfordians that Stratfordians alike that writing about royal courts, Italy, and law required a certain prestige level of education. Edward de Vere fits the bill here since he is known to have graduated from Cambridge University at the age of 14, becoming a Master of Arts at age of 16. Furthermore, in view of the plays like The Merchant of Venice, which discuss law, an extensive library underlining his qualifications to write as knowledgeably as Shakespeare. Underlying this argument is the fact that Venus and Adonis, derived from Ovid's, could only have been possible with Arthur Golding's translation of his work. Arthur Golding was Edward de Vere's uncle, and his translation was said to be dedicated to Edward de Vere. To further prove that Edward de Vere was qualified to write settings ascribed to Shakespeare, Edward de Vere is known to have traveled to Italy in the 1570s, putting him in an ideal position to write knowledgeably about Venus, the Merchant of Venice, Othello. Similarities between Edward's life and the character Hamlet. Similarities between Edward de Vere's life and Hamlet suggest that Hamlet was almost an autobiographical play about the Earl's life. Notably, Polonius' line of human young men falling out of a squabble with Sidney. Notably, Edward de Vere's father-in-law, William Cecil. Lord Buckley is said to have been parodied as the character Polonius. Only a person intimately knowledgeable of Lord Buckley's life could parody this man convincingly in Hamlet. Furthermore, only Edward de Vere fits the historical assertion in Sonnet 125 that Shakespeare's bore the canopy over Queen Elizabeth and her victory celebration over the defeat of the Spanish Armada. The parallels continue between Edward de Vere's life and subject matter in Henry Part 4. And part 1. It is known that in 1573, Edward de Vere and his company did routinely play practical jokes on ill-fated travels on the same stretch on a road as Prince Hal does in the play. The similarities between life and sonnets continue as Edward de Vere's poem, Anne Vadus Echo, composed for Anne Vassador, is likely to have been the exclusive dark lady of Shakespeare's sonnets. Furthermore, Anne Echo has more than a passing resemblance to the Echo verses in Venus and Adonis. And ending points, Edward de Vere's nickname resembles Shakespeare. At core, Edward de Vere was nicknamed Spear Shaker due to his ability both as tournaments and because his coat of arms featured a lion banishing a spear. Perhaps, coincidentally, Edward de Vere lived in the same area as Shakespeare, his Bilton Hall home being the Avon River and the forest of Arden on another.
Here, and this is Michaela Winfield's food, also did it, and we are negative, so that means we believe that Shakespeare is indeed the author of his plays and poems, his works. And just read the introduction. Just read. In our introduction, born of humble birth, Shakespeare was a subway man, well known for his, most notorious known for his our poems, and he is one of the greatest men of the Renaissance. Not born of noble birth, he was indeed one of the greatest men. Still, like such as everybody else in the Renaissance, our Renaissance men were. He did such great works and plays and sonnets that he wrote them, and they're still regarded as one of the best works of all time. My partner and I believe that the true author is William Shakespeare. Resolution, part 2. Therefore, we stand resolved that the works of William Shakespeare should not be attributed to Edward de Vere, the bad man in this. Our term is Renaissance, a period of the European history between 14th and 17th centuries, where there was a new inserts in the science and the ancient arts of especially in Italy, and our in our case is my partner and I believe that William Shakespeare should not be confused with any other writer for the name William Shakespeare appears on the plays and poems. And our first facts are in 1593, the narrative poem Venus and Adonis were published by Stratford native with a declaration to the Earl of Southampton signed William Shakespeare. And the thing with that is they look back from times whenever he was writing his name, and it matches the signature matches from those. And it contains typical fawning language of commerce addressing a nobleman for which basically we're saying he de Vere didn't have the knowledge that a common man would have had, and he wouldn't have spoke the lingo that Shakespeare would have spoken, and he wouldn't know it. To de Vere's performance and the inconsistence of several sources prove that he wasn't the author of Shakespeare. Like all other noblemen, he was expected to know poetry. He was expected to be proficient in it. This does not mean that he was anywhere close to Shakespeare's talent. Professor Alan H. Nelson quotes, de Vere's poems range from okay, middle of the road standards to, for the time, downright increasable, I guess. And then our second for that one would be one source that states that de Vere's composed, directed, and acted in his plays. The other source contributed by the standing. It was belonged to the nobleman de Vere status to write the plays. It basically means since he had a chance of being like king, or he was like high in royalty, why would he even risk writing plays? And if he were to be found caught or writing plays that were published, his name would be shamed, and the De Veres, and the De Veres would not want that, as nobody would. Then we have in 1601, the volume Love's Martar, I can't pronounce that word correctly, contains short poems by several well-known theoretical poets. One of these poems, entitled in the volume but not known as The Phoenix of the Turtle, is signed by William Shakespeare. This volume was printed by Richard Field, who was printed Shakespeare to narrative poems. And I would, since this has come to the end of our segment, I'd like to point out that up until, if this was a bigger argument, like I would have heard about it before this was assigned to me, and like nobody knows who De Vere was. Like nobody knows like the argument, and I guess it's not really. It's a big argument, but it's not like really well known. And if that was a bigger well known thing I'd just like to say that it doesn't seem like it's like Shakespeare and De Vere thing would be an argument. It would be bigger, as I'm saying. In our conclusion, when is Shakespeare a man of great honor? He made something of himself. People who still try to take away the credit that he so rightfully deserves. It's a shame that the man that has accomplished so much in his life must take this ridicule from people that give it to him. We should let this great man with this great name be taken away without blackened tongues, and show the respect that he deserves. So we should do this by giving him the credit that he rightfully deserves.
All right.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so you stated that he was an Earl of Oxford, therefore he had knowledge of upper class and the education to be able to write the plays. But just because Shakespeare wasn't an Earl doesn't mean he didn't have access later on in life, or even as a child when it stated he went to school that prohibited him from being able to write the plays and sonnets that he did write. He also mentioned that he was part of an acting group called Oxford Men, when really he owned it, but that doesn't really mean that he participated in it. And it was more just passed down from his father, who also owned it. You said he had you said De Vere had knowledge of law and the Elizabethan court, but Shakespeare had lost years, and it wasn't truly known whether he knew about the courts or not. And just because it's documented in De Vere's life doesn't mean it couldn't be documented or couldn't have happened in Shakespeare's life as well. Also, Edward de Vere his recorded death was in 1604, but Shakespeare's plays were still written and performed after that. Like, new plays still came out, so it kind of doesn't make sense that if De Vere died and he was the true author, that plays were still being written after he died.
How much time do we have? We have 2 minutes left.
Oh, well.
Would you like to use the last 2 minutes, or?
Sure.
It's not really. I don't think it has to be heard. Why don't I'll try?
I got it.
I got 4 minutes. Whenever you guys are ready.
Well,
You got the timer out? Alright. Okay, so I'm up here. here for the negative. I'm going to be telling these guys
You're
affirmative. No, against the negative. I'm here against the negative. Point is, okay, so for you guys' first contention, you said his names were on the poems. Problem with that is that just because his names are on the poems does not mean he wrote them. Throughout history, we have seen things such as people taking credit for other people's works, and just because somebody else's name is on it does not mean that it is theirs. We've seen this throughout history with the Big Eyes case, you know, the one with the movie about it. Okay, contention number 2 of De Vere did not have the same slang as Shakespeare did. It seems to be well known that De Vere had a secret life that, in other words, would be shamed had it been out in the open that he'd lived this kind of life. He could have easily have hung out with people similar to Shakespeare and had picked up the same type of slang Shakespeare did, so he could be more relatable to the audiences he was writing to. For your third contention that De Vere was not a good playwright / would be shamed if he never published, or if he was ever published, just that would add to our argument even more. Because De Vere would be shamed if he were to ever be published, this would force him to have to create a fake identity, a fake person, in order to take the credit for his work, because he would not want to be shamed. As far as not being a good playwright, this would go into him trying to take the trail off of himself. By writing his bad plays, people would not expect him to be able to write the good plays, and then that would allow Shakespeare to take credit for his work. And we're out of time.
I just like the fear thing.
I just
Okay.
want this to be done.
Oh, I need this.
Better debate if I debate against
Mm-hmm.
myself.
Mine too.
In our opponent's argument, they said that Earl does not mean he does not have another. Does not mean that he have. That Earl does not mean he has other names in life. But correct that with saying that
And a half left.
as regards Shakespeare's plays and sonnets, have been suggested that Edward wrote these under the synonym of Shakespeare. Okay. Next one. Shakespeare owned theater. There could have been multiple owners of a theater. Usually, it doesn't always have to be one. And Shakespeare had lost years, and it could have happened to anyone. No. What to say?
Don't, that's not what.
Then Shakespeare died in 1604, and his plays
30
came out.
seconds.
And his plays came out, and they argued saying that it doesn't make sense because Edward dies, and how could his plays still further? I mean, it happened to Shakespeare. Why can't it happen to Edward de Vere?
Okay.
Just because you guys said just because his name was on it doesn't mean like he wrote it, and why wouldn't he write it? And one thing I want to add is the connection between Shakespeare and De Vere isn't clearly drawn out. If De Vere was to write the plays, why would Shakespeare be the one to still it? Do they have any connection? Do they talk or anything like that? Is that what his will was or anything? The life of De Vere, it seems like most of his life he was, what you guys are saying, that he was forced to create an identity that would be an alter ego. He does this high stuff with the royalty, then he does with the lower people. Why would he want to be with the lower people? Why would he want to live that double life?
A minute.
furthermore into that thing was he lived his life in like that's kind of like living your life in secret, and I want to go back to one of my topics and saying that if he lived in life in secret, then why would he want to risk like anything that occurred like with his high standing if he were to be caught doing the things that he did, and especially back like in the 17th century, your name was a big thing, and you didn't want anything bad happening to your name, and you wanted it to be like spotless. So he would want his name to be clean as possible. And I wouldn't, if I were him, I wouldn't risk doing that stuff. I would write my plays in secret and burn them after I was dead, or right before I died, or whatever.
For the summary, I would like to just point out that Shakespeare gave life to writing through his plays and his sonnets, and many evidence we have pointed out in our argument backs this up. There is connection between his life and his sonnets he wrote, and the fact that people are trying to take it away from him is disrespectful, and we should give this great man, this genius, the recognition and love that he earned through his writing.
All right, for the affirmative summary, I would just like to sum it all up. Edward de Vere was more qualified to do what Shakespeare did. Edward de Vere was an earl. He had more knowledge than the Elizabethan courts. Hamlet described part of his life. He was a man who was simply caught in a situation in which he could not take credit for something he loved to do. So, what did he do? He gave somebody else the credit. Somebody who probably didn't deserve the credit, who didn't need the credit, but he did, because he loved doing what he did, which was writing. Sadly for him, in his situation, it was looked down upon, it was frowned upon to get such plays published. So yeah. He had to keep up his higher-upness. He had to keep... He had to keep his figure. He had to keep what people thought of him. People thought of him as somebody who was higher up in society, which at the time, being higher up in the society means you didn't take part in the entertainment. You didn't write the plays. You watched the plays. And even though he loved to write the plays, he couldn't. Well, he could, but he couldn't take credit for it, or else he'd be frowned upon and his name would be besmirched. So I believe that now, with how society is, and that he will no longer be looked down upon for doing something that he loved to do, that Edward de Vere should be given credit for writing the plays that he loved.
No, he doesn't that.
9 seconds left.
Shake each other's hands.
Good job. Good debate.
Nice debate.